All right. Hello, everyone. I would like to talk to you today about an approach I've been using in my private practice, mainly to work with couples. It's an approach that involves conceptualizing, assessing, and intervening. Um, so, just to give you a little bit of background, most of this probably is information we all know about. But so obviously one's early experiences, especially as related to attachment, are crucially important. But what we know is that what's even more important is how we translate them into internal representations, which in the end create a sort of blueprint or a frame of reference for us. And this includes, of course, belief, interpretation, emotion, relational dynamics, cognition, and more. And of course, accessing this transcription is what is at the basis of effective processes of change. So this blueprint is rich with internal representations, which are a largely unconscious template, which help us make sense of the world, others, self, and the world around. We know them as internal working models. Bowlby also observed that, as we develop from a very basic blueprint, we also begin to interact with our internal working models through what he called internal stimulation, which part of internal stimulation is even memory recall, your mental rehearsal of your expectations, your affective experience of visualization of things. And so it's important to understand that we just don't unconsciously activate the internal working models during interactions with others, but we also can shape them, maintain them, reinforce them, and even potentially correct them through mentalization. So, and neuroscience teaches us that the inner constructs and mechanisms, which include both pre-experiencing, which would include picturing, imagining things, anticipating things, and re-experiencing things, including memory and such, actually activate the same neurobiological pathways as actual behavioral experience. So, most of us are familiar with attachment patterns. Just a refresher, of course, was the secure attachment. The caregiver is available and consistently responsive. That's a secure base. And the caregiver is experienced by the child as trustworthy and empathic. When you have insecure, ambivalent attachment, the caregiver is inconsistent or not attuned to the child's needs, may alternate between nurturance and insensitivity or intrusiveness or being unavailable. The child doesn't develop a sense of security and may be both clingy and distrustful and not easily soothed. Insecure, avoidant, the caregiver is unresponsive, doesn't meet the needs. The child learns she's powerless, or he, of course, may become passive, depressed, in extreme cases even developmentally delayed, and may learn through this that expressing needs equals punishment or disappointment, and attempts to self-soothe later may translate into maladaptive habits like addictions. And in disorganized attachment, the caregiver is experienced as confusing or frightening to the child, and the child feels he is in a lose-lose predicament between longing and fear, and may become numb or aggressive, and the internalized sense of self is damaged or bad somehow. So the reason why I refreshed our understanding of attachment is because attachment is our first internal working model, and it comes to affect many things. I'm just going to mention a few that are particularly important then in the couple relationship. So self-regulation, which includes controlling and modulating our emotional responses, coping with stress, maintaining a homeostatic affective state. And what I mean by that is an affective state that is stimulating enough to maintain motivation, but not overwhelming enough to interfere with our functioning or become debilitative. Also behavioral regulation, synchronicity with others, basic expectations about other, and our basic stance on the dependence avoidance continuum, which we'll see in a minute. So of course, now I want to introduce the idea of schemas and scripts, which some of you who are clinicians might be familiar with. So like we said before, humans internalize an organized pattern of information and representations and expectations and interpretations that govern our sense of self, other, and the world, and these are schemas. And also blueprints for behavior in specific settings or situations, which are scripts. So when a child's healthy developmental needs, including safety, nurturance, acceptance, autonomy, identity, play, limit setting, are not met, maladaptive schemas and scripts are formed. And so these are psychological constructs which exist largely outside of conscious awareness. They really underlie all of our beliefs, identity, and are like an emotional lens. And they begin to form in a childhood and adolescence and are activated and updated throughout our lifetimes in a variety of ways. So our perception or reaction to any given situation really is affected by overlapping dimensions, which we'll see a little more in the interest of time. I'm going to go ahead. So also, when maladaptive schemas are activated in the here and now, the person may experience an intense emotional, cognitive, and behavioral response, which we know as a mode. So a mode is a specific cluster of cognitions, feelings, and behaviors characterized by this intense emotional arousal that can be activated by internal stimuli, like a memory or anticipatory thinking, or an external stimulus, like interpersonal interactions or the reality observed. Of course, these are filtered through the encoded schemas. And the maladaptive coping modes are dysfunctional automatic reactions, like incorporated defenses that are activated in a moment of stress or conflict. So we want to look at these innate modes that are activated at specific times based on schemas which we've internalized. And you can look at them, and this is one way of conceptualizing. Some of them are innate child modes. So you can imagine, so you see in the middle column, I don't know why the labels of the columns are incomplete, but so that's the mode, and the one in the middle we see really the root of it. So for example, the vulnerable child mode, the root of it might be unmet attachment needs, including safety, having a secure base, nurturance, attention, protection, empathy, love, etc. And when it's activated in a given situation, maybe in a conflict situation with a significant other, the associated feelings are a sense of overwhelming pain, fear, sadness, loneliness, and it can spill into maladaptive coping. Sometimes we see extremely disproportionate reactions in conflict between couples. And really, if you start to think about it in these terms, you see that really some of these behavioral patterns are an expression of these deeper schemas that are and modes that are activated at that time. So just to give some other examples, another innate mode might be the angry impulsive child who probably had unmet needs for guidance or validation of feelings and needs or the freedom to express oneself. And that may translate into venting, anger, explosive behavior, tantrums. There's also healthy modes which are underdeveloped typically when needs are not met. So for example, the underdeveloped happy child might be caused by unmet needs for play, spontaneity, attention, acceptance, encouragement to explore. That translates into an adult that probably has difficulty with those things. But when through intervention you're able to help him or her develop this happy child mode, it leads to feeling more loved, connected, contented, satisfied, validated. Also, another mode that is often underdeveloped is the healthy adult, which often the root of this is a lack of acknowledgement, lack of support for autonomy, lack of confirmation of one's sense of competence or identity. And so the difficulty here is maintaining needs in a healthy manner, maintaining responsibility, planning, enjoying pleasure, etc. And then you have the internalized dysfunctional parent modes. For example, the punitive parent, the root of it is basic rejection of the child's needs or abuse. And you see this mode being activated in an adult who had this background in a moment of conflict through maybe excessive resistance, criticism, harshness, kind of a tendency to punish self and other, self-centered processing, black and white thinking. And similarly, the demanding parent, maybe the root of it is unrealistic demands and standards, disregard for the child's individual needs. And the person having this mode activated may then set exceedingly high expectations for self and other, pressure self and other, have a kind of a tendency to be harsh and judgmental. And so you can see that there are many variations. These are just some examples, and it's a kind of an interesting way of thinking about the emotional modes that are activated during conflict and their roots in the individual's history. So this is a simple way of looking at it. Basically, you have the basic childhood needs not being met, which create these encoded schemas, and all our internal stimuli, which, like we said in the beginning, include memories and expectations and anticipations, and external stimuli, like the interpersonal interactions, get filtered through these encoded schemas and lead to an activated behavior. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some clusters of these schemas that have been observed, partially in other studies, partially in my own practice and experience. They tend to center around 5 clusters, and the first is the disconnection rejection cluster. So as you can see, one might have a predominant schema of instability and predictability, or abandonment, loss, social isolation, alienation, emotional deprivation, mistrust, abuse, defectiveness, or shame. For example, if you have a basic mistrust abuse schema, there's kind of an unconscious conviction that or expectation that others are out to hurt, humiliate, deceive, manipulate you, or use you, often intentionally. And maybe the defectiveness shame schema may include a deep-seated sense of being bad, defective, or unloved, or damaged. The impaired autonomy, performance, exploration, and play cluster includes these other factors. I'll give you an example. The dependence and competence schema tells the person on a deep level that he or she is not good, not resourceful enough, not capable enough to handle things on his or her own, or engage in independent problem solving. Or having a very basic vulnerability to harm schema, there's a sense that the world is dangerous. There might be exaggerated anxiety with regard to danger of illness or harm in general. The enmeshed, underdeveloped self schema arises from excessive psychological entanglement with another person at the expense of healthy psychosocial development. And so the person may believe on a deep level that it's impossible to feel fulfilled or secure without the other's constant involvement. And then we have the impaired limits cluster, and you have on one end of the continuum the self-control and impulsivity domains. So they're kind of mirror images of each other in the sense that with self-control, the person is very invested in maintaining emotional control, whereas with impulsivity, there's difficulty with maintaining emotional control. So in self-control, the person goes to great lengths to repress or control emotions and behavior, whereas a person holding a deep impulsivity schema might suffer from a real lack of impulse control, leading to rash decision-making or maybe excessive risk-taking. And on the other side, the entitlement and grandiosity schemas, you have an entitlement schema is associated with a sense of being superior to others and having a real primary need for achievement and low empathy for others. Whereas the grandiosity schema also involves an inflated sense of self, but it is more expressed in a narcissistic sort of way rather than focusing on having special privilege or control. Then we have what we call other directedness schemas. Basically, these speak to us of a sense of self that is more invested on the outside rather than directed within in some way. All these schemas entail a distorted, stunted, or partially obscured sense of identity that is deeply entangled with outside preoccupations. For example, you have the self-sacrifice schema, where the person really focuses on meeting needs of everyone else at the explicit expense of his or her own. And there also may be a kind of pleasure or codependent addiction associated with this schema, almost a pride with this priority, but also mixed with this deep-seated unconscious dissatisfaction and unawareness of a genuine self. You have the underdeveloped individuality schema is active in those whose sense of self is maybe more closely affiliated with a group, like a cultural, familiar, or religious group, than with awareness of individual qualities, needs, and thoughts. There might be a lack of critical thinking, a deep disconnection from personal needs, wishes, and beliefs outside of the group affiliation. The subjugation schema entails a surrender of control to others, a sense of being coerced into passive acceptance in order to avoid pain or abandonment. And then we have the cluster of overvigilance or inhibition. And here we find various stances of either under or over expression. So for example, the emotional inhibition schema presents as this intense inhibition of both negative, like aggression and anger, and positive emotions like joy and pleasure seeking and play, and a preoccupied focus with rationality at the expense of feelings. And then you have, for example, the unrelenting standards or hypercriticalness rigidity schema involves this deep-seated belief that one must obsessively meet unrealistically high standards. This might also be expressed as hypercriticalness, like holding others to the same impossible standard, which is at the basis of a lot of conflict in the couple. Or you have the negativity, pessimism, worry schema, like a long-standing pervasive emphasis on the negative or dangerous aspects of life. Or the punitiveness schema, kind of go back to what we said with the innate child modes. Maybe you've internalized a very punitive parent, and this might be expressed later on with kind of a tendency to be both self-punitive and very harshly judgmental of the partner in this case. So if I want to take you through a simple practical example. You might see, okay, so you have, let's say, John, and what you know about John is that his girlfriend hasn't answered the phone for a couple hours, and he flies into a rage and takes a baseball bat to her car and breaks her car. Now, you look at this outside behavior, and you could interpret it in many different ways. But if you know that John, for example, was raised by a mother who often berated him, belittled him, was self-absorbed, judgmental, controlling, unpredictable in her affect and in her emotions, he really had early deprivation in some way, some unmet needs in terms of guidance and acceptance and nurturance and validation, positive modeling of impulse control. And so the schemas that he holds that are deep might surround themes of mistrust, like we said, so an expectation that others will willingly harm you or deceive you. The schemas of deprivation, inhibition, and instability. And so in this case, you have the external stimulus, the girlfriend can't be reached for 2 hours, and his internal stimulus, which is his rumination. What is he thinking about? He's imagining her having sex with 10 different men, and she doesn't care because she's probably out shopping with her girlfriends maybe. Maybe she's not having sex with the men. Maybe she's shopping with her girlfriends and looking at the phone and ignoring him. And this is what he's thinking about. And it's getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and his angry child is activated. And there you go, baseball bat in the car. That's the logical outlet. It's the maladaptive coping. So if you want to look at it this way, at the very core you have his unmet needs for the guidance and validation and nurturance. Then you have his encoded schemas. Then you have the mode that gets activated. You have his maladaptive coping, which in this case is acting out and displacing his emotions from fear to anger. And then you have the outward behavior of him damaging the car. So Bartholomew had an interesting idea here, basically that a sense of self and sense of other can be largely dichotomized as positive and negative, and found that largely if you tend to have a positive sense of self, you will tend to have low levels of dependence with other, and if you have a negative sense of self, you will have a high level of dependence. And similarly with avoidance, if you have a positive model of others, you might have low avoidance and negative high avoidance. So you can see in these four examples what tends to happen if you have, for example, both positive sense of self and positive sense of others. You might be low on dependence and low on avoidance. It's pretty balanced. You're comfortable with intimacy but also autonomy. On the other hand, if maybe you have a negative sense of self but a positive sense of others, you might have high dependence and low avoidance. So you might be preoccupied, ambivalent, and overly dependent on your partner. If you have a negative sense of other but a positive sense of self, often you see you're dismissive, you deny attachment, you have discomfort with closeness. And lastly, if both of these parameters are negative, you might show kind of a fearful, avoidant pattern where you desire intimacy, but you distrust the other and fear rejection. So this might lead to kind of erratic patterns within the couple relationship. So basically, the assessment process really is part of the intervention, because the clients are already gaining significant insight through this process. So you have the intake session with both partners, and then you do some work separately. First of all, you want to find out about their attachment patterns, because we said that's the first internal working model. So you do an attachment interview, you assess each partner separately, you assess their internal working models and schemas, you administer their coping styles. I like to use focus genograms to understand the larger family system and history. And by what I mean by focus genograms, is that instead of just being a general picture, maybe you focus on attachment patterns through the generations for as much as they can report, or maybe how emotions or a specific emotion has been internalized and processed also in the larger family system. And so you conceptualize the case by considering various factors. Just one word about the maladaptive coping. Basically, all these maladaptive coping reactions can really be grouped into avoidance, overcompensation, retaliation, or surrender. So they roughly correspond to flight, fight, freeze. So somebody that automatically copes through avoidance might run away, deny, self-soothe, withdraw, dissociate even, or have addictive behavior, or like we saw before, displace emotions. Somebody who is drawn to overcompensation, retaliation, is kind of like the fight response. You might be unfriendly or cold. You push away your partner. You act out. You react to pain with anger. Maybe use cynicism, dark humor, or maybe a sense of grandiosity. And maybe the freeze response is more about surrender. So you give up. You accept yourself as defective or weak. You have an external locus of control. You sacrifice yourself to avoid discomfort or conflict. So this is a picture of what I really want to come to when I am done with my assessment of each partner. And then you want to put these two things together to have some deeper insight on the main issues that you really need to work on to address the deeper roots beyond the actual problem that is going on in the couple, really speaking to each partner's deeper issues. So you can say you want to look at the family of origin, the emotions and attachment history, the kind of the current qualities of the pair bond attachment, their basic view of other, their basic view of the world, their active schemas, the modes that are usually activated during conflict or distress, their preferred coping style or their maladaptive coping habits. They're also their identified resources that during the assessment it's very important to kind of hone in on what can you use that is positive in the person to help you through the intervention. Where they're positioned on the dependence avoidance continuum that we saw with the sense of self and other, and their view of self, of course. So the intervention takes on different forms. I don't have really time to get into it. So it involves schema work, it involves cognitive restructuring, imagery work, and also art and writing therapy. So the schema work involves all these things, which I don't believe I have time to really get into in detail. But you kind of help the client get in contact with these things that we've talked about now, the schemas and the modes and the coping habits, and also help the couple understand each other's aspects in this way. You could use cognitive restructuring to really alter thought process and correct the maladaptive ways of thinking and reacting to the internal and external stimuli, really address cognitive distortions, which here we have some examples of. Imagery work is also very important because, like we said in the beginning, mental images, including pre-experiencing and re-experiencing, activate the same brain mechanisms, so it really can be used to correct and adjust some of these internal working models. And art and writing therapy also is very valuable because it can facilitate the emergence, expression, transformation of all this intrapsychic material. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about my case example, but to give you a sense of how this translates into an actual person, the basic schema we saw before of what I like to be certain of in terms of my assessment before intervening. This is kind of what it would look like in the end when you have the two partners. So you look, in this case, at all these different aspects. And you compare them to her partners. And if we had time, I would explain a little bit more to you about each of these people's background. But what's important here is that once you have a clear idea of all these things, you're really able to go at a deeper level, and also both partners gain the sort of insight that goes beyond their dynamic between the pair bond and more into their own personal also needs, the deep needs, and how the relationship can actually be reparative in that way. So I think I stop because I'm well over my time. So if you have any questions. No? All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.